بتاعتي هتكون معظم الوقت بالانجليزي، مش متعود اني احاضر بالعربي. So the challenge, the dilemma for every person, whether a patient or a doctor, is regarding to the decision of fasting. There is so many reasons for that decisions. Now, if there has been an evolution, as we all know, in mobile phones over the years and in mobile networks. And the same has happened with the risk. How do we quantify for the risk of a person with diabetes in Ramadan? When we provided these first guidelines in 2005, 17 years ago, with the ADA, we had a table of 4 risk categories. As time passed by, the risk categories were modified to a traffic light system, not terribly dissimilar, but just make it maybe more easier. But still, it was like a table with specific categories in every single group. Now, if I were to take type 1 diabetes, it's always been very high in the old guidelines. And again, hello?
في مشكلة في الصوت.
أعتقد يمكن في حد فتح الأوديو.
أستاذ أحمد؟ لا، هو في الصوت طالع، الناس بتشتكي منه. أستاذ أحمد.
ثواني يا فندم هشوف حاضر.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum again. Sorry for the interruption. Apparently, there's been an audio issue. Now, I was mentioning that the risk categorization in the old guidelines was based on a table of, and if I take the example of, for example, type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes has always been in the tables considered as very high risk. In the latest guidelines of 2016 with the International Diabetes Federation, type 1 diabetes was maybe put into 2 levels, either poorly controlled, and that would be very high risk, or well controlled, and that still would be put at a high risk. If I were to look into guidelines that we developed with in UK, you would see that type 1 diabetes comes as high risk as well. The reality is different. The reality is here in Egypt, 65% of people with type 1 diabetes, according to a survey that we published 2 years ago, which included 1,800 persons from across many countries, as you can see, have shown that the reality is different. Now, this is not just a problem of type 1 diabetes, it's a problem of so many patients that we are in need for a better way of quantifying their own risk. So how do we do this? How do you and I, when we sit in the clinic, think of the risk certification to be a bit more comprehensive? We need to think of many aspects, including the Ramadan-related factors itself. So which country you're in. So in Egypt, for example, what season, what weather like, and the social circumstances of the individual. For the diabetes-related factors, the type of diabetes, the duration, the complications, the therapy. And today we'll hear a lot about the therapy in the diabetes and the impact of this. The proneness to hypoglycemia, and with this we mean القابلية لانخفاض السكر, the access to care, and then of course some individual factors, the age of the person, the occupation, and many other aspects. Going back to the type diabetes, it's clear 30% of people with type 1 diabetes decide not to fast. In Egypt, I've shown you that it's even above 30, it's 35% decide not to fast, while this is in 16% only in type 2 diabetes. Why do many people with type 1 diabetes decide not to fast? It's related to hypoglycemia. The data that we've seen shows that 62% of people with type 1 diabetes develop hypoglycemia during the daytime. And this is only 15.7% in people with type 2 diabetes. So clearly, you have to differentiate between type 1 and type 2. And then a question about age and duration of diabetes. Now, with age, normally we would think of the old, but nevertheless, many of us would be concerned about the adolescents who would wish to fast. Of course, the vast majority of them would be type 1 diabetics. Now, when we did this survey, which we published, as I mentioned, just last year, and we compared the data of those who are below the age of 18 to those who are older, and we actually did not see any significant impact on being younger. Now, of course, we know from Sharaf point of view, from fiqh point of view, fasting Ramadan is a must for adults. So whoever is a child is not obliged to fast. But teenagers, some of them will be adults, and whether they are fit to fast or not, well, what the data is showing is that age is not the issue, it's the other aspects that we need to discuss. That is actually the opinion of the guidelines of the International Society for Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes, and they simply say may fast provided they fulfill certain criteria. يعني مشروطة، واعتقد انها تكون مشروطة مش بس على الادolescents for type 1 diabetes، دي بالتأكيد الاشتراطات تنطبق على جميع مرضى السكر. لو تتوافر عدة اشتراطات معينة يبقى may fast with safety. Going back to age, the vast majority of us, when we think of age, we think of being older in age. And the question here, does age matter? Going back to the guidelines, in the vast majority of the guidelines, we were just talking about being old age with ill health, or in some of the guidelines, they specified above 75 years of age. I don't like specifying a specific age because I might be very healthy above 75, and I might be unhealthy and much younger than that as well. So I think it's the health that matters rather than the age itself. So when you look into the data of the age relation, you'll find that those who are older, 30% of them do not fast in comparison with those who are young. Why that is the case is because of hypoglycemia. As you can see, the rates of hypoglycemia and the rates of breaking the fast because of diabetes-related issues is much higher, nearly double that of the person who is young. So clearly, age matters. When we look into the more aspects, the more severe aspects, such as admission to the emergency department or admitted to hospital. So in the young, this is 1%. In the above 65, this is 11.6%. So again, clearly age matters. And if we take hyperglycemia, because hyperglycemia is also a very important issue. Again, those who reported significant hyperglycemia, there is a very significant increase according to age. What about duration of diabetes? After all, we have people who are maybe newly diagnosed versus people who have been diagnosed with diabetes many long years. Same pattern as age. You see here the rates of intentional fasting. In those who are young, it's 87%. Sorry, those who are with short duration of diabetes, it's 87%. In those with long duration of diabetes, over 20 years, this is 71%. And again, when you look into why that is the case, it's hypoglycemia related. So in those who have diabetes for over 20 years, rates of hypoglycemia is 24%. in those who are between 0 to 10 years, it is only 14%. So nearly double with the longer duration of diabetes. And again, when you look into hypoglycemia severity with hospital admission or ER visits, it nearly quadruples, and it shoots up from 10 years of duration or longer. So clearly, we need to think of all of these matters, even for hyperglycemia. Again, the same pattern. After 10 years duration of diabetes, the problems start to get a lot more significant. Therapy is very important, and you will listen from my colleagues tonight about in the agenda about the impact of therapy. But we've seen this in many of the studies. If a person is on insulin, the risk is much higher compared to a person on oral therapy. And if the oral therapy includes sulfonylurea, specifically the older generations of sulfonylurea, then the risk of hypoglycemia is a lot higher. But it's not just any insulin. In this particular study done in my hospital, we looked into the continuous glucose monitoring. And we gave patients 6 weeks of sensors. So here there is the basal insulin versus the intensive therapy. And those with intensive insulin, which was either mixed insulin twice daily or basal bolus, you can clearly see that the hypo duration doubles, and the frequency of the hypos less than 50 milligrams, which is considered to be clinically significant, is nearly quadruple. So certainly the type of insulin also matters. What about complications? Well, again, the presence of chronic kidney disease makes many people decide not to fast. So the decision of fasting in those with kidney problems is they decide not to fast in 27%, while in the general population it's only 18%. They break the fast in 29%, while in those without kidney problems it's only 20%. And when you look into daytime hypoglycemia, it is 30% in people with nephropathy, while it's only 23% in those without. Now, the problem becomes a lot worse when you add both problems together, type 1 diabetes as well as nephropathy. Here, you end up with nearly 50% deciding not to fast, and nearly 50% or over 50% will develop problems that leads to breaking the fast during the daytime, and mostly because of hypos, which is here 64% versus those who are with type 2 diabetes, 25%. So as you can see, it's not just about a category. It is multiple layers of the problems. So do you have kidney problems or not? Yes, that's an important point. On top of it, what type of diabetes? And on top of it, the age and the duration and many other aspects. The same would apply to cardiovascular disease. 31% of those with cardiovascular disease and diabetes decided we will not fast. So that is also clear indication. Why that is the case? Again, when you look into it, it's related to the emergencies and the hypoglycemia. And if you add here the going to ER or hospital admission in those without, it is about 5.5%. Those with cardiac problems, it is about 11.6%. So all of these issues need to be thought of. One size does not fit all. You cannot just put the item into a table and say, this is, you belong to that category, because the other factors would either make it worse or easier. And there's been lots of calls of revisiting the recommendations. As I mentioned, after all, 49% in one survey showed that type 2-1 diabetes were able to fast the whole month, and many of the older generations who are considered as high risk in guidelines are anyhow fasting. I'm proud that we have developed a risk calculator. You can find this risk calculator in the application, on the DAR application. If you download the DAR application, you will find here the risk calculator. You would so again here, the DAR Academy application, because we have two applications, the other one is for patients. This one is for you as a healthcare professional. the Dara Academy again. You press on it and you come with the categories of the risk calculation. Now, as I said, this is a dynamic process. You might say, I'm not certain about the value for this item versus the value of another item. Having said that, at least this is a systematic approach that will take away individual opinions. And we've heard in many meetings how individual opinions would vary. Here, you would take into consideration the type, the duration, the hypoglycemia frequency, severity, and awareness, the level of glycemic control, the type of therapy, and here the type of therapy is accumulative, because you could have a person on multiple of these therapies and they will all add up in the risk calculation. The severity of chronic conditions and acute conditions. Pregnancy. Pregnancy is clear. We have an asterisk here on pregnancy because pregnancy and breastfeeding are automatic exemptions. And thanks to Professor Ines and many of the groups of the association, they highlighted to us that we need to make it a bit more obvious, because we thought when we wrote the guidelines that everybody knows that pregnancy and breastfeeding is an exemption. So we made it again in the risk calculator that without diabetes, they are exempt. With diabetes, it's even more and more. And I would like to add a certain point to everybody who thinks that pregnancy is okay to fast. Now, perhaps the mother would be able to fast. That's up to her. But she's taking the decision for the baby and the fetus. The fetus cannot fast. And that fetus has not been in a decision-making process. So we need to protect the fetus as much as possible. Monitoring during Ramadan is very important, not just for hypo, but of course, many of us in Ramadan, كنافة, قطايف, أمر الدين, علي, والأكلات الملائم الكبيرة. So we end up with hyperglycemia post meals. So of course, we need to check on the blood glucose levels, not just for hypo, but for hyperglycemia as well. Now, luckily in Egypt, our fasting hours are under 16 hours, but it's not just about the hours, it's about what nature of job. I'm lucky I work in an air-conditioned office. Some other people, during the day, they'll be running and rushing from here to there, perhaps catching ميكروباص ولا اتوبيس عشان يروح عمله، وعمله ممكن يكون physically demanding. So we have to take all of these points, and perhaps this patient is on hypoglycemic drugs or on diuretics. So you need to think of all of these points, and even if you have to modify the number for your individual patient. Age, we think about it from a social circumstances if the person is living alone. But more important than age is the frailty and the cognitive function of the individual. And lastly, the person's own individual experience. Someone who ends up with serious problems rather than that we cannot judge it or measure it clearly with a specific item. Alhamdulillah, the risk calculator والrisk categories في الجايدلاينز أخذت موافقة هيئة الأوقاف، وماضي عليها مفتي الديار المصرية والشيخ مجدي عاشور الأستاذ في جامعة الأزهر، كما الأمر بالنسبة للمفتي كمان، وفي اتفاق ما بين العلم والدين فيما يخص النقاط دي. وطبعا دي بترفع العبء عن الطبيب انه يقول لشخص صوم او ما تصومش، لان لما تطبق الكلام اللي مكتوب في الكالكوليتر ده الكلام بتاع المتخصصين سواء من الناحيه الطبيه او من الناحيه الدينيه، وبالتالي ترفع العبء عن نفسك. ولابد طبعا ان احنا ننصح المريض بالنصيحه الصح اللي تواكب حالته، وفي النهايه القرار للمريض. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, fasting can be a challenge for us and for our people with diabetes. A systematic approach is required with a tool that is regionally sensitive. Perhaps every tool needs to be modified locally, but certainly we need a comprehensive approach. Ramadan Kareem, and I'm looking forward for any questions from our attendees. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Mohamed Hassanin, for the very important lecture and informative lecture, actually. And we have now a question. It's not a question, it's a demand from Dr. Mona Hassan Abdelhamid. Please, we need material of the lecture and the new guidelines. Dr. Mohamed.
شكرا دكتوره منى. اكيد المحاضرات هتكون موجوده على الويب سايت النقابه وللجمعيه. الجايد لاينز نفسها تقدري تلاقوها على الاي دي اف ويب سايت www.idf.org. حضرتك لو كتبتي اي دي اف رمضان هتلاقي الجايد لاينز كلها موجوده وفيها الريسك كالكوليتر وكل الجايد لاينز بشكل عام. جايد لاينز شامله وافيه. ولو حبيتي تدخلي على الملخص بتاع الجايد لاينز منشور الشهر ده في المجله بتاعت Diabetes Research and Clinical Practice and it's a free download. وطبعا دكتوره ايناس وبعض الزملاء من مصر من الناس المشاركه الكو اوثرز للجايد لاينز.
Another question, Dr. Mohamed, from Dr. Iqbal Dessouki. If a patient on basal bolus and he wants to fast, is it possible to shift to mixed start twice? How to calculate the dose?
I'm not certain that I would do that. Is it possible or not? Yes, of course it's possible. But would I change a person from basal bolus to mixed star? Actually, we sometimes do the opposite. لأن الميكس ستار انسولين ممتاز لكن ما بيدينيش الفلكسبيليتي، ما بيدينيش المرونه، لكن البيزل بولس فيها المرونه. البولس دوز نفسها ممكن تتغير من وجبه للثانيه على حسب انا هكون دلوقتي بفطر وبفطر فطار خفيف ولا بفطر فطار تقيل. والسحور طبعا اقدر اغير الدوز لوحده من غير ما بكون بغير في الوجبه الثانيه. النصيحه بالنسبه للبيشنت اللي على بيزل بولس، اللونج اكتنج انسولين محتاج ينقص من 15 ل 30% لو المريض ويل كنترولد او حتى سلايتلي مودريتلي كنترولد. انما لو هو سكره مرتفع جدا مش ما تحتاجش تنقصي البيزل انسولين. الشورت اكتنج انسولين بتعدليه على حسب حجم الوجبه. لو في الافطار الوجبه كبيره بنفضل سايبين الدوز زي ما هي او بتزيد. اما بالتاكيد في السحور محتاجين كده ننقص الدوز لان الشخص هيكون صايم بعدها ومش هياكل لا اي سناكس ولا اي كالوريز ولا اي حاجه ثانيه.
Another question, Dr. Amira Abu Laila. Most of my patients insist on fasting Ramadan despite all the risks. The question is, can I give insulin HR of low dose in Nahar Ramadan to avoid hypos in those uncontrolled diabetic patients?
تمام. اعتقد هي تقصد human regular insulin في اثناء النهار. بالنسبه ناس كثيره بتسالنا السؤال ان ممكن اقدر ادي انسولين للبيشنت اللي هو هايبرجلايسيميك اثناء الصيام. خلينا نقسم السؤال لجزئين. A patient insisting on fasting مفهوم وبنشوفها كتير. دورنا ان احنا ننصحه النصيحه الوافيه الكامله وباصرار. صمم يبقى في الاخر الامر يرجع له. اما بالنسبه لليوم اللي هو فيه سكره مرتفع جدا لا انصح طبعا ان الانسان ياخد انسولين بدون اكل، خاصه اللي هو الريجولار انسولين. فالشخص اللي هو سكره مرتفع جدا عليه ان هو يفطر في اليوم ده ويعوضه في مره ثانيه ويحاول يتواصل مع الطبيب علشان يعدل الانسولين دوز. perhaps الدوز ريدكشن او الاكل الغني اثناء اليوم اثناء السحور واثناء الليله اللي قبليها يكون سبب في ارتفاع السكر ومحتاج تعديل.
Another question, Dr. Mohamed, from Dr. Qasim. How can we interpret the hypoglycemia if diabetic patient, although there is insulin deficiency? Can you read it?
Yeah. How can we interpret the hypoglycemia if diabetic patients, although there is insulin deficiency? Well, I guess you're asking about in a person not on insulin. So if I were to understand your question, you're thinking of a type 2 diabetic person who has insulin deficiency and he's hyperglycemic. Why would they develop hypoglycemia? Well, they're not insulin absent, and if they are, they will be on insulin itself. Plus, they perhaps will be on sulfonylurea, which stimulate the pancreas to produce some insulin. The presence of some insulin in the absence of a good level of blood glucose level during the fasting hours, specifically during the time between suhoor and asr, would make the person exposed to hypoglycemia. That's how it happens. So it's the balance between the amount of insulin available in the person's own blood or insulin taken as an injection and the amount of glucose stored in the body.
Another question, Dr. Amal Salah Al-Hamaki. Is pericarditis
and myocarditis within 2 weeks prevent fasting? Well, Dr. Amal, we're not cardiologists, but from a general physician point of view, pericarditis and myocarditis are very serious cardiac conditions. And if a person, I'm talking here about a person with diabetes. So I would presume a person with diabetes have pericarditis and myocarditis 2 weeks ago. يعني الدين يسر ولا عسر. ده شخص كان عنده مرض شديد جدا من أسبوعين ويمكن did not fully recover from it. وممكن يكون له تبعات تأثر على المايوكارديوم أو على risk of angina or heart failure. So I would prefer to نديله راحته، ياخد راحته، يتعافى من المرض وبعدين يعوض الايام دي في المستقبل rather than ان احنا نحطه في الريسك ان هو يصوم ولسه خارج من بريكاردايتس ومايوكاردايتس ويحصل له مضاعفات ويبقى كده هو وضع نفسه في التهلكه. فمن الراي العلمي اللوجيك ان advise this person not to fast ويعوض ان شاء الله كمان شهر ولا 2 هيبقى تعافى تماما ويقدر يعوض الامور دي.
Any other questions?
هو في سؤال احنا مش فوتناه، ما هي اصناف الاكل الموصي بها عند الافطار والسحور لمرضى السكر؟ I don't think I can، يعني نقطة مهمة جدا، خلينا نقسمهم لجزئيتين. عند السحور avoid simple sugars، avoid الاكلات الحادقة والمالحة اللي تعمل عطش. Increase in fiber and increase in protein and very small amount of natural fat زي الفات اللي موجود في الديري برودكتس او شويه فات اللي على طبق فول ولا حاجه زي كده. لكن الفكر ان انا اعبي شوجر علشان يديني ستورز ده بيرفع السكر فجاه وبيروح فجاه. محتاج مريض السكر الاكلات اللي بتقعد في المعده في السحور مده طويله زي البيض زي الفول زي الجبنه. ونقلل من ايه؟ من الخبز او من الاكل من النشويات الثانيه. في السحور طبعا للاسف عادتنا ان في افراط، في مثلا تمر كتير، في مشروبات سكريه كتير، في رز وفطاير وحاجات ثانيه كتير، ودي برضه بترفع البوست برانديال هايبرجلايسيميا. فاكل متوازن يكون ممتاز جدا بالنسبه لمريض السكر. ما بنقولوش ما تاكلش الاكلات اللي كلنا بنحبها ودسمه، لكن الكوانتيتي والفريكونسي هو هنا الكنترول فيها.
An important question, Dr. Mohamed, from Dr. Abdullah Hussein. What's your advice, sir, for those who decide to fast against medical advice?
Wallahi, my advice for them is we need to explain to them and be patient with them and keep advising several times in every single possible non-confrontational way. ما فيش داعي للعنف، ما فيش داعي للغضب، بشكل مبسط نحاول نشرح لهم بقدر الامكان، وفي الاخر كل مريض يقدر ياخد قراره بنفسه وهو اللي بيتحمل الاجر او الاثم عن خطأه. لان الامور واضحه. لو انا طبيبي نصحني بشده اني نفترض ان انا دلوقتي عملت حادثه بالعربيه هايبوغلاسيميا وانا صايم، والطبيب قال لي انت على درجه خطوره عاليه من يجي لك هايبو اثناء رمضان، والحادثه دي تسببت في اذى بعض الناس، انا بالتاكيد مش هاخد ثواب عن صيامي ده، انا اكيد هاخد اثم عن صيامي ده. وبالتالي ده المريض عليه ان هو يكون فاهم الامور دي. نفس الامر بالنسبه للبريجننت، للسيدات الحوامل. لما بقول لها طب نفترض ان في احتمال حصل مشكله للجنين، هل تتصوري انك هتاخدي ثواب ولا تاخدي اثم؟ فالامر بيكون واضح ليها. لما بيكون الحوار فيه هدوء وفي كلام علمي مدعوم بثقافه دينيه لبعض الامور، اعتقد الشخص على الاقل بيكون بينه وبين قرار نفسه فاهم هو بيعمل ايه.
Another question, Dr. Mohamed, from Dr. Khalid Mohamed. Is it better to have one iftar meal or to divide it by two with 2 hours in between?
والله طبعا احنا دلوقتي الصيام في شهر ابريل، مدة الصيام حوالي 15 ساعة، وبالتالي عدد ساعات الأكل هي 9 ساعات. تسمح لمريض السكر إن هو ممكن يأكل 3 وجبات ما يكونش فيهم إفراط. فلو قسمنا وجبة الإفطار ما يبقاش فيها تخمة، ما يبقاش فيها إفراط في دهون كتير وسكريات كتير، وفي الآخر ياكل حاجة تانية على الساعة 11 12 وبعدين يتسحر. أهم حاجة بالنسبة لي إنه يتسحر، ويتسحر as late as possible with as much as possible fiber and protein and with as less as possible of carbohydrate and sugar.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamed. These were the questions. Thank you very much. And let's shift to the coming lecture.
Thank you very much. أشكركم دكتورة إيناس، وأشكر الدكتورة رانيا، وموفقين كل الجميع، وكل عام وأنتم بخير. مع السلامة.
مع السلامة.